Paul is a climate physicist, and as many of you may know, we're planning on holding a search in the physics department in climate physics, and so we're bringing in some prominent climate physicists to talk to us, teach us a little bit about the field. We really appreciate Paul's time today as he's talked with us all day about this. Paul works in a variety of different areas, and including atmospheric dynamics, theory. He develops tools for the community in Earth system models, as well as data mining tools that are useful for observational data, and also works on cold climate processes, including snow and ice cover and Arctic linkages with the global climate. And it's this last area that Paul's going to be talking to us about today. The title of his talk is The Physics of Changing Polar Climates. Please join me in welcoming Paul to Boulder.
Thanks, Mike. So I have a microphone on me, so I think I'm good. All right, thanks everyone for coming. It's been a really fun day. I've been getting lots of good questions about life in our department as a climate subgroup, atmosphere, ocean, climate science subgroup within a physics department. So that's been great. So my guidance today was to provide a talk that would be accessible to students, to everyone. The classical colloquium formula is, the first third is for everybody in the audience, the second third is understandable by the specialist, and the last third is understandable by no one, including the speaker. So that's what I'll try to do today. Maybe a bit better than that. But you'll see the parts of the, before I go on here. Okay, that worked, but not my toggling. Good, okay. All right, so I'm going to start with an introductory section, which will take up a lot of the talk, actually. Just a bit of a review on polar change. So the topic is quite broad. You'll see that at the end, I'll specialize down to a particular set of research papers and projects that I've been focusing on in my group. But before we get there, I'll try to motivate the broader question of polar amplification of climate change. And then in my own research, I'll talk about particular tools and methods we use to study that problem. And you'll see it's focused, but I think it has implications that deal with the problem as a whole. And as I get to the very end, so I'm going to talk about how we try to induce polar amplification using artificial methods in our models, and some of the things we've learned about that. But also recently there's been some critique of the methodology that we and other groups are using to study these problems. And so, the question, the models are, like many models, all models are wrong. And the question is, how useful are they? So that's what I'll deal with towards the end. And then we'll just wrap up with some conclusions. And I am happy to take questions as I go along. I'm the chair of our physics colloquium at Toronto, and I think it's a lot better when there's interaction. So I do welcome questions. But let me kind of step back. Now, I know you've had a colloquium on the physics of climate, and from Tiffany Shaw, and I believe that she started from a similar point. So I'm going to start as well from something that we in the field are very proud of, which is the awarding of part of a Nobel Prize, the Nobel Prize in 2021 in physics to Suki Manabe. So this was the Nobel Prize for physical modeling of Earth's climate, quantifying variability, and reliably predicting global warming. So there's lots in that citation. I'm going to start with Suki's some of Suki's oldest work. The very oldest work dealt with a column of the atmosphere. And looking at the global problem of climate change, just looking at the vertical profile of temperature change in response to CO2. This work that I'm showing here came a few years later, and the idea here was that the geophysical fluid dynamics lab, where I did my postdoc work and stayed on for a few years, was the first place where there was a concerted effort to create a model that tried to realistically represent the atmosphere in some detail. And so the equations that were solved by this model are represented in this schematic from this Manabe and Weatherald paper, now almost 50 years old. You can see that there was a very basic representation of a sectoral scheme here, 120 degrees, where you had some land, some sea, roughly representing the geography of the Earth. And the idea was that you take this model, the sea here was very crudely represented as kind of a swamp, what's called a slab ocean. And CO2 was, the carbon dioxide was doubled in this. So this is a time series of observed changes in carbon dioxide from the Mauna Loa Observatory. I'm going to assume that you're basically familiar with this Keeling curve. So this was an effort to basically represent through on a computer the thermodynamic equations of motion, radiative transfer, interactions with the land surface, including snow and precipitation processes, and to see what happens. And so this is a classic figure from this paper. This shows the response of the temperature, so the difference between the doubled CO2 experiment and a standard experiment in which the CO2 was held fixed, all right, of the temperature in the longitudinal mean, so we call that the zonal mean, to this change in CO2. And it's plotted in a funny way here as a function of latitude. 0 degrees is on the right, 90 degrees is on the left. So think of this as your Arctic or your Antarctic. And the contouring here is kind of famous in these papers, that sort of artistic contouring, you might say. But what you can see is that there's a general degree of about 3 degrees of warming, 2-3 degrees of warming in the latitudes equatorward of 50 degrees. Okay, and then when you reach the poles, you get a great amplification of that warming, 10 degrees Celsius. Right. So these are substantial changes to this doubling of CO2. Also in the stratosphere, you see some cooling, all right? And these are all these responses are kind of the basic signatures of the pattern of climate response when CO2 is changed in the atmosphere. This is 50 years ago, kind of basic prediction of this. So beyond global warming, we have a pattern of climate change: tropical warming, polar amplification, and stratospheric cooling. And this is really held up, right? So we see this a lot. So I assign this as an exercise in an introductory atmospheric science class. So this is an upper division class I teach. It's also cross-listed with our first year graduate class. And I say, okay, just look at gridded observations taken from what's called a reanalysis. So this is a retrospective forecast of the atmosphere. You have about 50 years to choose from now, and I just asked them to plot the decades of the 2010s versus the decade of the 1980s. So just take the difference, and this is the zonal mean temperature. It's plotted here as a function. I didn't explain the vertical coordinate, but this is a normalized pressure. Okay, from like 1 atmosphere at the bottom to this is about the boundary of the troposphere and the stratosphere. So it's about 200 or 0.2 atmospheres here, 200 hectopascals or so. And this is the same. This is in a logarithmic scale here, but you have 1,000. This is 1 atmosphere, 1/10 of an atmosphere. And what I asked them to do is plot this and look at this old picture, all right? The point is that you can go pretty reliably from decade to decade, and you see this basic signature, all right? I'm not talking about quantitative changes here, but you see amplified over in the trends we see in the observed world, the real world. We see amplification that's very strong in the Arctic. And there is some amplification in the Antarctic. It's not very strong. I'll talk about that next. But you can see there's quite a bit of warming in this particular pair of decades. I mean, this is not the best way to do trend analysis, but it gives us a basic sense. There's consistent stratospheric cooling from decade to decade. There's some warming in the tropics. So this polar amplification of the climate signal is kind of one of the primary concerns of polar science. Yes, any question?
So if you get high enough,
Yeah.
why is temperature cooling?
So this is the changes we're seeing are strongly influenced by the absorption and emission of infrared radiation. So here, what you're seeing, what's explained here, and explained in like all these papers by Manabe, is that basically here, where you're adding more long-wave emitters into the stratosphere, and basically this is the optical thickness of the atmosphere prevents you from seeing upwelling radiation at those levels. You're seeing purely the effect of adding extra CO2 to emit more long-wave radiation. So that drives the cooling, and that's what we see. we really see this and reliably in the stratosphere, stratospheric cooling driven by greenhouse gases. So that's one of the classic signatures. And that's very straightforward, like a radiative effect. Does that answer your question? Yeah, yeah. OK, so that was 1970s, all right? And then the lab kept working. And so about 15 years later, this work by Ron Stauffer at the same lab with Suki Manabe. What they did to the previous schematic, this was kind of briefly summarizing many years of development, they added a circulating ocean to the whole thing. And the geography became much more realistic than this. So this started to look like our modern climate model. So if you add a circulating ocean here, you allow for an oceanic response to this change. And then we can start to get more quantitative and realistic. So this is a plot of it's another temperature response, okay, another temperature change. And this is the change relative to a control simulation of the zonal mean surface temperature. So we're only looking at the surface here. We're taking the longitudinal average, and we're plotting it as a function of latitude. Is that clear to everyone, what's going on here? So the axes here are time, and 90 degrees south to 90 degrees north. Let's see what we see. So what we're doing is we're increasing CO2 at a rate that's kind of mimicking what's going on with industrial activity, like basically a doubling of CO2 every 70 years by a 1% increase. And this is a very standard experiment now. Okay, this was new then. And so introducing this circulating ocean, you start to see some structure in the pattern of warming. So you definitely see warming in the Arctic, and you see some warming in the Antarctic, and it's amplified relative to the tropics. And you see that there's a lag, okay, in the rate of warming in the southern hemisphere rather, and there's always this polar amplification signal. All right. So this is a plot of the observed zonal mean temperature from NASA from the 1880s to 2030s. Of course, this is an observational estimate. All right. It's incomplete in its way. I've always been inspired by this pair of figures because what we see here is papers published in 1975 and 1989 predicted this kind of structure in a general way. Quantitatively, it's a different story, but the general pattern of climate change was predicted by these models, which had very coarse resolution, 4 degrees latitude, longitude resolution. And there was no real hint that there was real Arctic amplification happening at the time. But this was a prediction, a projection several decades ahead, and we've really seen a lot of Arctic warming, right? So now we're in a situation now where this problem has been studied a lot. So what I'll try to do is kind of bring in a few newer papers, and this is one from last year. The Arctic has warmed nearly 4 times faster than the globe since 1979, right? So this has been quantified in many different ways. Yes.
So, kind of naive.
No. Good.
Question.
Yeah.
Why in the world are we seeing symmetry between the North Pole and the South Pole?
That's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, it would seem like based on like a really naive model of the Earth,
Yeah.
we expect it to be largely a function just of how far you are from the equator.
Right. So the real question that, there's lots of questions about what actually sets these gradients between the tropics and the poles. That's actually the fundamental question. But in these transient experiments, what's happening is each year you're adding a bit more carbon dioxide, and the ocean is responding along with the atmosphere and land. But the ocean is kind of setting the time scale for much of this response. And the simplest explanation for this lag is that there's a lot more ocean in the southern hemisphere than the northern hemisphere. All right, that's the simplest explanation. However, these papers actually dealt with the circulation feedbacks involved, and there's been lots of back and forth. And that's a very relevant question to this day. How much of the heating that we see reflects an ocean dynamical response that's actually actively taking up heat? How much can be understood from a basic thermodynamic perspective? So that's really good. And why is the warming just so strong, in the Arctic, and how model dependent it is? You'll see that there's actually a lot of uncertainty in that as they go along. But does that basically answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. The
yeah.
southern and northern hemispheres don't look very much alike.
Yes, yeah, they're very. You can almost think of them as slightly different planets if you want, but they're all the same planet. But I think it's worth thinking about the geography and the Arctic being a basin that's enclosed by land, right? And the Antarctic is literally the polar opposite, right? It's a land cap surrounded by ocean. So all those figure into those responses in a basic way. So I want to just point out this has lots of consequences. So let's say we say that this very simple model predicted this kind of response, and we're seeing hints of it. And so, if you look at, there's many aspects of polar change that are happening all at once. But this is just like one estimate of the mass change in some of in the major ice sheets, right? This is this is quite recent, all right? And just showing you this like ongoing secular change in terms of the total mass of the ice sheets and the associated projected sea level rise that's associated with each of these mass changes. So this is ongoing, and this is really the effect of increasing melt days and increasing warming. And doesn't look like it's going to get better soon. So this is just another sort of headline type paper, unavoidable future increase in West Antarctic ice shelf melting over the 21st century. So the ice shelf melting is one of the contributors to this. And this relates to just the fact that the oceans are warming up and they're taking up that heat and they're exposing those ice sheets to more warming underneath the ice shelves. So this is an ongoing concern. And then I get to sea ice. All right, so sea ice is where I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about this. And these plots, I want to point out, actually, I'll point out in a couple of slides, but when I have gold here, this is University of Colorado gold. So this is a shout out to you guys, all right? So point is that when you see gold labels here, it's stuff that's happened right here in Boulder. So you should be proud. The news is terrible and grim, but know that seriously the CU and NOAA and NCAR labs here have been just a key part of the whole climate science development. And you'll see little gold tags all the way. I had to look this. This is the right color, though, right? This is the okay, yeah. I did a little ink match, so it should be okay. Anyway, so here's the serious thing. So this is data that you can look at yourselves at NSIDC, National Snow and Ice Data Center. And what we see is the goldish colors. That's just a coincidence going to the darker colors. This copper is indicating earlier years, and the dark colors are indicating most recent years. The record minimum of Arctic sea ice extent, it occurs annually every year in September sometime. And the record minimum was in 2012. All right, where we saw a reduction from typical values of over 6 million square kilometers down to about 2.6 or so. All right. And this is what a map of September Arctic sea ice looked like in 1980. And here's 2023. This year was not a record minimum, but it was still quite low. And this, you can't really see this purple line here, but that indicates sort of the median extent of the sea ice. All right. Over in Antarctica, if I'd given this talk last year, I would have said, well, we really haven't seen very much change in Antarctic sea ice, except that this year, and I was asked about this at lunch, we've had I guess it's a 6 sigma event. Okay, so really Antarctic sea ice, its growth and decay was quite regular, and there weren't really trends. But like most recently, we have seen this just this year. This is 2023, and for some reason, another unpleasant climate surprise, we've had this really great reduction. It's not very dramatic here. The drama that you could see from space in terms of polar sea ice extent in the Arctic was that this big chunk of ice in the west, in the sort of eastern Arctic here was really bit out, and that started in around 2007. In Antarctic, it's more zonally symmetric, so it's a bit more subtle, but it's definitely measurable and very, very concerning, right? So basically, this is again something that has been noticed is that the Arctic sea ice has declined, and in fact, it was declining back in 2007 when we first had a really record. We were on the verge of a record minimum. It was declining faster than forecast. This paper also had a bit of predictive anticipation, because actually it was September 2007 where we had the first really major minimum. So again, this is work going on right here. So these four, I don't think is Ted Scambles here, I'm not sure, but everybody else was from here in Boulder area. Okay. So what's special about the polar regions? Like, why do we need to focus on it separately? So I don't think I need to convince you that the polar regions are different, right? But it's specifically how they are different and why those differences matter for this amplified climate signal is what we really spend a lot of time thinking about scientifically. So, okay, so this schematic actually, so it was co-led by a very nice workshop paper from Jen Kay and Hugues Goose at Louvain. In this paper, we were trying to sort of pull together all the different processes that were influencing feedback processes in the polar regions. Some of these are radiative feedback. They influence reflection or absorption of solar or infrared radiation. Others are more internal to the system. I don't want to go through all of them, but the main point is that polar regions have lots of ice, right? 3 phases of water. Phase transitions make it more sensitive to external influences. They have very strong atmospheric stratification. So the atmosphere is very cold. This line here represents kind of current condition inversions at the surface. So we have very cold air at the that's basically driven by radiation right at the surface. Cold dry conditions mean that we have a strong inversion that's pretty permanent all through the year. This is the representation of that change as a result of climate change. We get a lot of Arctic warming. So that's actually going to change the stratification in the atmosphere, where you used to have a lot denser air at the bottom. Now you're going to have less dense air. So that has some implications. There's also a very great deal of sensitivity of the ocean to both temperature and salinity, which plays a large role in controlling what's going on in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. And there are strong connections through circulation and transport to lower latitudes. So the point about this particular diagram, just to give you a big picture, is that there are lots of processes involved, and you can quantify feedbacks that lead to either amplification or attenuation of climate change signals. So if you have some warming and you have a positive feedback, such as the albedo feedback, which is associated with a darkened scene once you have some sea ice retreat, and which promotes additional warming on top of the warming that caused the sea ice retreat. That's a positive feedback, but there are lots of other feedbacks, including the lapse rate, which interacts with absorbed and emitted infrared radiation, feedbacks involving clouds, and you can see there we have various signs attached to these feedbacks in this perspective article. But we've done much more than attach signs. So one way of representing how the feedbacks matter for polar amplification is to ask how each feedback process contributes to warming in the tropics on one axis and in the Arctic on the other. So if there's more warming in the Arctic than in the tropics, that means you have Arctic amplification. This is focused on Arctic amplification instead of like Antarctic and Arctic. If you have more warming in the tropics, then you have tropical amplification. And what you can do now currently with our models is calculate many different feedback process contributions. This is just a list. I don't want you to memorize the list. This will not be on the test. But you can see that there's a lot involved, right? There are many different processes. The dominant ones in this particular schematic are the lapse rate feedback and the albedo feedback. Those get you farthest away from this diagonal line, which means that they promote the strongest Arctic amplification. This P prime is the structure of the Planck feedback, or just basically the black body radiative response to changes. All right, so that also actually gives you a bit more once you remove the global mean, you get a bit more or less cooling in the Arctic than in the tropics. Now, this other figure here is a more detailed version of this one. This shows individual dots. Each dot here represents a different model. So our Earth system models now have come a long way. I won't show you much about those, but the Earth system models that we use, there's a large suite of them now. And these are put together in what's called model intercomparison projects, in which different groups around the world share their data, share their codes, make the codes openly available, but also drive their models with consistent protocols. So they try to make sure that they're running the same experiment and use the same data formats. And so we're able to analyze all these models in the same way. And all I want you to get from this picture is that there are ranges of estimates for these different feedbacks, okay? And each model has its own story to tell about which feedback is most important. Now, there's two sets of dots, two sets of figures here, or symbols here. There's circles and X's, all right? And the other point that's made here is that different methods of estimating these feedbacks give you different assessments of what's important. And the circles here, are, we argue, are a better estimate of the feedbacks involved. And I can get into that in questions. But I think the main thing to pull from this figure is, I guess there's 3 points. First is, we have lots of different feedbacks at work, and we can estimate how each of those affects, as an independent process, affects the amount of Arctic warming we have versus the tropical warming, and hence the difference between the polar regions and the tropics. Okay, and there are lots of processes that are potentially important. Individual models we use to estimate these processes are uncertain in exactly how these processes are represented, and there's some method dependence. So as a methodology, we're getting to the point where we can quantify a lot, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. And so what's the big deal about that uncertainty? So it turns out that polar amplification is pretty uncertain in the model. So all the models agree that there should be more warming in the Arctic in particular, and a bit more warming in the Antarctic than in the tropics. But if you look across all the models, you can see there's quite a bit of spread. So what's actually plotted here is the warming for all the models we had at the time of this paper, normalized by the global mean. So this is purely intended to show the spatial structure of the pattern, accounting for the fact that actually models have different levels of warming. And that's a separate issue that I won't talk about so much today, but is our actual uncertainty about how much warming we have or should expect. And what you can see is that basically we have most of our uncertainty in the warming in the higher latitudes, especially in the Arctic. All right, so this is, so the real question then is, if we're trying to predict from our models what the difference between the temperature in the tropics or the poles is, we have to deal with this uncertainty. And this is kind of the state of the art. That's where we are now. This isn't really getting better. We still have this considerable uncertainty. And at heart, it's the physics question we have is, what controls the equator to pole temperature gradient? We actually don't really know that. There's a lot of mysteries about the climate system, and the fundamental mystery, one of them is, what controls the strength of this gradient? What controls the strength of the jet streams? What controls the tropical overturning circulation? These are all kind of classical salient issues in our field that haven't really been solved, even though we have lots of model data to look at. I think we have a lot more tools now, though, to look at these questions. And we have, that's where the interesting work lies. Now, if we have uncertainty in feedbacks, then we have uncertainty in Arctic amplification. That's the point I'm trying to make. This is another way and another lens onto that issue. Okay, so what I'm plotting here, I know this is a bit complicated, but I'd like to sort of just give you a big picture of some much more recent research. So this is a paper, Alex Yan, who's here on faculty, played a big role in this, so it gets the gold. And this is a scatter plot from the models, all right? And here's an observational scatter plot. Basically, this is a measure of the normalized, of the temperature change induced by climate change. It's actually normalized by the amount of CO2 emissions versus the amount of change in Arctic sea ice. Again, this is all with respect to changes in CO2, but basically you can think of this as global temperature change and sea ice change. The observations here, we have a pretty great uncertainty in the observational estimates for this. There's a variety of ways of doing this, but basically what we're expecting is about 0.5 degrees of global mean surface temperature change per 1,000 gigatons of carbon emitted. That's kind of what we estimate from now. That's our observational constraint. And about this is 3 meters squared, okay, of sea ice area change. So this is the sea ice that you'd see from space, just the sea ice extent, per ton of carbon dioxide emission. So there's slightly different scalings, but this is to relate it, have this in relatable units, all right? So each ton we emit of CO2 reduces sea ice by about 3 meters squared. And I looked at Colorado's emissions and Ontario's emissions. They're about the same, which is a little strange because we have a lot more people. But it's about 100,000 acres of sea ice loss a year induced by Colorado's emissions. So that's like foot-acre. So there's a lot of sea ice, and Ontario as well. So that's what we see here. But what you see in the models is kind of a whole range of things. Now, this is not a mess. This is actually kind of what we expect when we look at these models. They have a variety of responses in both in global mean temperature and also in Arctic amplification and sea ice that goes with it. Mainly what I want you to see here is that when we get more global warming, we tend to get more sea ice loss. So the two things are linked in ways that might not be causally directly related. But basically, models that are more sensitive to greenhouse gases overall tend to lose more sea ice. And some models tend to lose way too much sea ice, all right? Others, not very much, and maybe too little. And the models that get about the right amount of sea ice loss that we expect from observations, normalized in this way, tend to be the ones that warm up too much. So there's kind of a mismatch. So we say actually the models are undersensitive. Their sea ice, which is really tied in with their Arctic amplification, seems to be undersensitive. We're perhaps seeing too little warming in the Arctic per degree of warming, of global warming. So that's kind of a key uncertainty. Is this good? Are we good? OK, all right. The Antarctic picture I'll go over very briefly. Until this year, right, basically until the last couple of years, we hardly saw any change in Antarctic sea ice. In fact, this Antarctic sea ice was increasing a little bit. But the models were all predicting that over this historic period, we'd be losing a lot of ice, and it would go kind of closely with Antarctic ice, and it would go kind of closely with increases in global mean surface temperature. Now, if we added 2023 to this, that wouldn't really change the trend, I don't think, even though it's a big trend. But I think this picture will be modified. But it seems to us so far that Antarctic sea ice is melting too much in these models for reasons. So it's more symmetric than we expect, and that's a bit of a mystery. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
How much of that is just versus?
This is Antarctic floating ice. This is floating ice on the ocean. So the icebergs are treated separately, but they're not a significant contributor to these. I don't think that's really included in these estimates of these like millions of square kilometers of ice that we're talking about. Like, it's just the floating seasonal ice that we see every year. Versus there's also there's ice that survives the year, but then there's the ice that's attached to land, which is the ice shelves, and then icebergs were formerly attached to land, but they calved off. So that's what this is incorporating. It's the seasonal, what we call the seasonal cryosphere, which I showed you those seasonal cycle plots. That very dramatic, millions of square kilometers every year, right? That's what I'm focusing on here. Yeah. So how does all this matter? So it turns out that there's just a ton of interest, not just in polar change, but a huge literature on all the things that that Arctic change is doing to extreme weather in mid-latitudes, to the impact on the jet stream. All these things are thought to be coupled, that what we're seeing in the Arctic is impacting severe weather, the storm tracks, which is kind of the regions of strong storm activity over the oceans. And so this Arctic focus is also warranted by like societal concerns as well. So just to kind of recap my intro, which is of course long, is just to say that polar amplification was predicted long ago. All right, I think I've shown you that. Models underestimate Arctic sea ice loss, which is a sign of Arctic amplification, and overestimate it. So there's uncertainty there. So the causes of Arctic amplification remain uncertain, and the consequences are potentially far-reaching and are actually remain debated. So now, let me tell you about my research. Okay, so what we do in my group is try to take a piece of this problem, which is very large, and kind of apply the tools that I've become comfortable with over the years, and to try to see what we can learn by taking a model and interfering with its sea ice. All right, so we're going to go into these models, and as one way of understanding how polar amplification operates in the Earth system, we artificially induce polar amplification through sea ice loss in Earth system models. So I've had some questions, so I think I'll plow ahead. Okay. So what are we doing here? So what we do is we take a model that's been forced by increasing CO2. Okay. So I showed you a version of this figure. This is an updated version from the 1970s. All right. This is from 2013, which is the penultimate big climate report from IPCC. And this shows this classic signature now of Arctic amplification, stratospheric cooling, tropical warming. Okay, these are all sort of expected and seen in lots and lots of models. The dots indicate that all the models agree, on the sign at least. And what we do is we take the sea ice out of these models, all right? And this is the sea ice loss that we have for a certain amount of greenhouse forcing. And we're going to impose that as a perturbation, but keep the greenhouse gases fixed. Okay, so this is an example. This is from Clara Desser's work up at the Mesa Lab at NCAR. We've been doing this for years, and I think this is a really nice paper that summarizes some of the key points. So we can do this. We have a choice of the models we use, and we can either impose this perturbation of sea ice, right? So we're just changing sea ice. There's lots of different ways of doing that. We can put it in a model without an active ocean, all right? Or we can put it in a model with a dynamical ocean. There's different ways of imposing these perturbations. And what you see, what I hope you see, I see this, okay, is that it really makes a difference whether you have a dynamical ocean in your system, depending on for the same sea ice perturbation. And so the response we get really depends on the ocean model. So what are the main differences between these two figures? So this is a prescribed ocean, so we keep the ocean surface fixed. All the atmosphere sees is the ocean and the sea ice. So if we keep the sea surface temperatures fixed, you have to make some decisions about what happens to sea surface temperatures right where you impose the sea ice perturbation. You get a lot of Arctic warming, right? And then it extends a certain distance into the troposphere. So this is about 500 hectopascals, or half an atmosphere. So it extends up to about 700 hectopascals. There's some changes in the stratosphere here above 200 hectopascals. Not much else, right? But if you allow the ocean to respond, then you start to get some of the same pattern as you see in the original system. So the idea here is that in the coupled system, once the ocean is allowed to respond, the ocean surface warms up, all right? And you start to see warming in the tropics, right? The overall warming in the tropics is an expected part of the global warming process. So we get a mini global warming. This is a nonlinear contour scale designed to emphasize these other features that pop out. But the point is they don't show up unless you allow the ocean to interact. And you even get some warming in the Antarctic, even though the changes are all in the Arctic. So the ocean is bringing in this full coupled response, which is really interesting to me. So these things are coupled, and we're trying to understand that in more detail. So what we've done in my group, this is a paper now several years old from Russell Blackport, using the community year system model of NCAR, so it gets a gold. We used a different method to impose sea ice change than in the previous figure. We actually just changed the surface albedo of the model's ice to mimic basically induce sea ice loss through changing surface properties. Because we didn't want to interfere too much with the energy balance in the model, so we just thought, well, let's change the surface properties, all right, and see what happens. And so what we got was the following. So first of all, this is showing that we had to run our simulations for quite a long way. So this is several hundred years for the system to equilibrate. So this is a long control simulation. This is a model with climate change in it. This is a long control simulation that we branched at year 2000. About 200 years in, we branched this albedo perturbation simulation. So that is, this is what I have showing here is the sea ice area. So the sea ice drops from about 9 million square kilometers down to 6, all right? So that's a nice long time series to average over. And it's having an impact on the sea surface temperatures of the northern hemisphere. So this sea ice change is actually warming the oceans away from the Arctic. And even in the tropics, it's actually warming a bit, all right? So what we see is when we impose just albedo forcing, so just the change in albedo, we see polar amplification and a bit of tropical warming. When we impose greenhouse forcing, and that's shown over here, we see a lot of Arctic amplification and a lot of tropical warming and stratospheric cooling. See, there's no stratospheric cooling here because we're not actually changing the composition of the atmosphere at all. We're only changing sea ice. So to understand this, you see there's couplings between the tropics and the polar regions. And so what we've done is develop a method of just linearly combining these two simulations to try to isolate what's going on from sea ice changes versus changes in the tropics. And we're trying to express a bit of to try to resolve some of the uncertainty, because we know that there's global change, and we have these simulations, and they're hard to compare because for the same amount of sea ice loss, you get, by design, you get a lot more sea ice loss here, a lot less tropical warming. But we want to try to find the kernel of what's going on here. And so our kernel idea is basically the following, all right, is that if we have some field like temperature or it could be upper level winds, whatever, that depend on the global temperature and the amount of ice, we can estimate from our two simulations the effective response as if one was changing and not the other. So the idea is called pattern scaling. It's motivated by a lot of work that's been done to understand how like similar patterns of response for different levels of greenhouse warming. And so it's basically a linearization of the statistics we get out of the model and it's actually quite simple. I don't know if it looks complicated, but it really isn't. These are 4 numbers that we get from each simulation. The change in temperature in the tropics, the change in sea ice under different forcings, either under greenhouse forcing or under just sea ice forcing. And from this, we get a pattern of response. The change in some quantity with respect to a change in tropical temperatures, and the change in that same quantity with respect to the changes in sea ice, with each of the others held fixed. It's an estimate, okay? It's kind of guaranteed to work because we're just solving 2 equations and 2 unknowns. And we use that as a way of diagnosing what's going on. So to get back to this figure, so this up here is what I showed you before. These are the responses to the change in albedo, and this is the response to the change in greenhouse gases. And what I'm showing you here is a combination of these two to isolate the response to sea ice and to isolate the response to greenhouse gases. And what we've done here is, what this estimate does is attribute all the changes we see basically at high latitudes to the effect of sea ice. And so that's kind of built into the estimate. But what we also learn in this is that it also explains something about changes in circulation. All right. So when we drive a model like CESM with greenhouse forcing, and we look at the changes to the zonal mean, so the longitudinal mean winds, the jet streams, we see actually that there's strong responses in the upper atmosphere, but basically very little going on in the troposphere. When we impose sea ice change, all right, we see actually quite a strong response in response to albedo forcing. I don't want to exaggerate the strength of the response. It's a couple of meters per second, right? It's not very large up in the upper atmosphere. It's down to like less than half a meter per second in the troposphere. But these are very long simulations, so these are significant responses. And what we see is a systematic equatorward intensification of the jet stream. So stronger winds, stronger westerlies in around 30, and weaker westerlies around 50. And this is in response just to the sea ice change. So how can we reconcile these two pictures? Because we know that sea ice is changing here, but we don't see much of a response. And so the idea is that we can use this estimate, this pattern scaling, to separate out the effects of tropical changes and ice changes. And so what we see here is that when we try to remove the back response of the tropics, we see this equatorward shift of the jet. And what we also see is that the tropics are trying to push the jet the other way. And this is called a tug of war, that the tropics and the polar regions are sort of locked in a battle in a way. That's kind of a tug of war. And that there's a negative feedback. And that's one of the reasons we don't see a strong response in the jet stream in this particular model. So that's kind of how we're diagnosing these simulations. So we've applied pattern scaling to many, many different fields. This is a more recent paper by Steph Hay, looking at, and I didn't mention the students. I skipped by that. But all this reflects the work of couple of generations of students. So Russell Blackport, Stephanie Hay, Alexandre Odette, who just finished, and Luke Fraser-Leach, who's working with me now. So in Steph's work, she took a broader picture of what was going on in several of these models and calculated these sensitivities with respect to sea ice loss and low latitude warming. And so the point is, these patterns of response in temperature, in sea level pressure, and in precipitation, each one is separately attributing responses to changes in the tropics versus changes at high latitudes. So this is getting at the question of what the consequences of these changes are. And really, in the climate warming problem, the tropics are a huge driver of changes we see in mid-latitude. So if you remember from this year with the El Nino we had, a lot of warming patterns we have originate really in the tropics, and that affects both temperature and hydrology. This is a response. This is showing the response in various models to precipitation changes. And all these models, there's about 5 models involved in this study, and they all did sea ice loss simulations. So that's the number, there's a large community doing this kind of work. And they also had these other simulations where either the sea ice was constrained in some way and CO2 was increased. So we could do a lot of these different estimates. And this is giving us a sense of the broader picture of what's driving what polar amplification is driving. Now, I hate to do this, but I'm going to skip something. Another part of the work, which I'll come back to maybe if there's time, is related to changes in the storm tracks and how sea ice loss is affecting changes in the storm tracks. But what I wanted to kind of do is kind of show you sort of one of the issues that's arisen more recently in the work that I just showed you. And this gets me to this lovely quotation from Box. So you've heard. I think you've heard different versions of this. This is actually a quotation from their papers. But remember that all models are wrong. The practical question is, how wrong do they have to be to not be useful? You're basically familiar with this, right? Okay, yeah. Those in applied math should be, I guess. All right. So the issue is that these simulations we've done by putting in sea ice loss, there's a concern that, in fact, we're exaggerating the effect of the actual changes in the Arctic on the system as a whole by doing this. I'm airing dirty laundry here in a way. It's not that. Well, dirty laundry is often hidden, so I don't know what people do with laundry when it's like, how do you hide it? But anyway, but the idea here is that when we look at actual climate change experiments and actually look at how temperature responds to a doubling of CO2, we see Arctic amplification, right? So there's tropical warming of about half a degree per million square kilometer of ice. And then depending on the model, you'll get maybe 2 degrees Celsius of warming per million square kilometer of ice loss. When we impose ice loss in these models, right, we're not doubling CO2. So there's a little bit of tropical warming, but really not very much. And we get this huge increase, right? So we span maybe 1.5 or 2.5 degrees and a big temperature gradient. And Mark England made this very basic point that we're probably overemphasizing Arctic amplification and we're kind of explaining too much, all right? So what we were trying to do is salvage value from all these simulations we've done. And first of all, try to see if this is correct, and I think it is. And then try to understand what we are actually doing with our experiments. So it's been very valuable, and that's why I wanted to sort of leave you with this point. So even though there's this problem, we think we can still it's still worth doing these experiments. So the basic issue is that you can understand it with a much simpler set of equations. All right? So the basic issue is that if we look at the global energy balance, all right, and there's this energy balance model. This is there's lots of versions of this, all right. But this basically is a time-dependent equation for enthalpy of the ice ocean atmosphere system. It's highly vertically truncated. You have shortwave or visible light forcing the term here. This represents a linearization of long-wave radiation. This is representing atmospheric heat transport, and then you have F, which represents forcing from CO2. Okay, so it's a very simple equation, and actually is useful to guide our thinking here. So if we have, let's say, look at the time mean, so we forget about this term, all right? And we just double CO2, that just changes the radiative forcing of the system. So Mark England's point is that there's going to be a response in both the short wave, and this relates to the albedo effect. As ice melts, it exposes a darker ocean, so you get increased absorption of sunlight into the ocean. So that's a positive feedback on the process. But to balance this out, you have also a long wave response. So the point here is that the true, when you sort of work everything out, it turns out that the true sea ice effect, the only thing that sea ice change itself is doing in the global mean and annual mean picture is changing albedo, and that is the primary forcing that's happening. The thing is that when we target a certain amount of sea ice loss, we're imposing that albedo change regardless of what's happening to the change in temperature. And that leads to the problem of too much Arctic amplification in these artificial experiments we do. So the way to resolve this, we think, because we think these experiments are simple to do, and they're about one of the only tools we can think of to really pull these signals out in a systematic way. So I know this is a complicated slide, but basically what we're showing here is an experiment where we just change the sea ice in a way that's consistent with the global energetics. And that leads to this total effect here, which is in black. This is a change in temperature as a function of latitude. And we do pattern scaling to reveal that this true total response can be broken up into a sea ice loss effect and a low latitude warming effect. So this is like a basic decomposition that we can do. Diagnose this energy balance model using this very simple technique. This is an experiment much more like what we do with our comprehensive Earth system models, where we target a certain amount of ice loss. We impose that, and what this leads to is a signal where we have a ton of Arctic amplification, which is shown in blue here. And also, we have tropical amplification. And actually, we almost get cooling that comes out of the pattern scaling estimate. And believe it or not, in some of the figures I showed you, there was actually a bit of a signature that somehow the tropics was driving polar cooling. And I always knew that was a bit suspicious, but this is the first time we actually have an explanation of it based on a very simple set of simple equation of an energy balance model. So what we realized is that we need to really think carefully about our basis for doing the decomposition. So the decomposition I showed you used as control variables the tropical temperatures and the sea ice. But if instead we use the perturbation we're imposing as one scaling variable and either tropical temperatures or global temperatures, we get a very different picture of how these things are decomposed. And so basically these dashed lines here show an alternate scaling that actually leads to a result that's much more representative of what we see in the experiment we think is closer to the physics. So it's actually hard to do this true ice experiment in a GCM. We can do these kind of experiments, but they give us this misleading answer. So what we did was we took this revised approach to pattern scaling and we imposed it in the sea ice experiments that we've done. And our argument is that, so the blue here is the scaling that I showed you before, the blue solid curve and the gold solid curve. This is a scaling we did before, so both polar amplification in a tug of war with tropical amplification. When we revise this scaling to reflect a better set of variables that I think captures the physics, we get some Arctic amplification, but we don't get this weird cooling coming out from the tropics or being attributed to the tropics. So we think what's happened here is that this critique has pointed out there's an issue with our experiments that we need to correct for the artificial effects we're putting in. And what we're trying to say is that we can still extract value from these experiments by doing another post hoc correction, like doing post-processing to account for it. And so that's where we are. Basically, the issue is that the kind of tug of war that I talked about, I showed you before, this tug of war response in the winds. Different color scale, but same idea. A positive response in the winds at these latitudes, a negative response. If we correct for this effect of excessive Arctic warming, then that whole tug of war gets reduced a bit. And I think that actually makes a lot of sense. So this is where we are right now. And so some of what I'm trying to tell you here is that some of the model dependence and method dependence requires really careful thought about our physical understanding of the drivers of polar amplification. So I think where this should go is more in the area of understanding these different feedbacks and how they're coupled and how we can use that feedback analysis to get further insight into the simulations we have. Okay, so just to leave like at least 5 minutes for questions, just to say. So I think I've said this a couple of times, right? Manabe and colleagues predicted the pattern of polar amplification almost 50 years ago, right? Simulated polar change does not quantitatively match observed polar change, and so there's a wide because there's a wide range in how models represent the processes. So we have some issues that we need to resolve, and we've probed the dynamics in different ways, which I described. It's an important time in the field because we're coming to the end of a large intercomparison project called PAMIP, Polar Amplification Model Intercomparison Project. And so we're asking now, like, how should we design these simulations? What can we do? We can be misled by simulations that don't have the right design. So we have to figure out, and so there's a methodological questions here of like, what do we do to really extract the physics we want to understand? What is the origin of the range of model feedbacks that I showed you? Does induced polar amplification provide a good test of its effects? And what are the global benefits of improving polar Earth system representation? I must be thinking about something else. Polar Earth system representation. So these are the kind of questions we're wrestling with. And I won't give you any answers today, but I will say, just to advertise, put a plug in for a program that we're organizing. We have an upcoming program at the Kavli Institute for Theoretical Physics, KITP, with the title Physics of Changing Polar Climate. So that my title was no accident today. It's a bit of a plug for the program. This is involving oceanographers like Patrick Heimbach, atmospheric scientists like myself and Gudrun Magnusdotter, and then ice sheet community for Mathieu and Hélène, and a host of advisors. So you might recognize Brad Marston, who's a fellow physicist. And what we're trying to do is understand these fundamental issues. So we'll have, it's a 10-week program taking place in 2025, so lots of advance notice. The application deadline is February 2024. I invite you to apply. Look at this up at KITP. See if it's interesting. Apply. And basically, we have our early admission deadline here, or early consideration deadline, and then there's rolling admissions if you need a bit more time. And so that's where I'd like to leave it. I think we have just like a minute or so for questions, so I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Questions? Yes, Andy. I don't know if we're recording.
Okay. I guess, so it seemed to me like a lot of what you were discussing is based on a desire to get sort of more quantitative agreement between, I guess maybe this is a naive question, but it seemed to me like the main kind of, like the main agreement was just these qualitative points about stratospheric cooling and polar amplification. I guess, are there other aspects of the climate models where there's like pretty quantitative agreement at this point?
Yeah,
and it's
I don't want to exaggerate the level of disagreement, but it turns out the polar regions are where, so I think that the agreement between sort of the level of stratospheric cooling and the tropical cooling, there's lots of quantitative agreement between models and observations. There are also areas of disagreement where trends that were predicted didn't emerge as quick, or aren't emerging as quickly. There's a lot of uncertainty arising from the different types of forcing that are imposed in the models and cloud responses. But it remains the case that polar amplification itself is really uncertain in these models, and that's why I was emphasizing it. But I don't want to give you the impression that there's lots and lots of model and other evidence that these projections are basically on the right track, all right? But you always have to qualify it with words like basically, right? I think you have to be honest, right? But in terms of what I was showing you here is also some of the corrections that are done are these are routinely done in all types of environmental prediction. You have a model, you have to correct for its biases. So you should not take these models at face value ever. You shouldn't take any model at face value. You always have to confront it with observations, and if there's ways of reliably correcting it, say just based on analysis of the past record and seeing how those corrections play out, I think you should do that. And that's true of all the forecasts that you use every day. I mean, those are all bias corrected and by forecasters. No, you really shouldn't be taking the models at their face value. Yeah.
Hi, really nice presentation. And I'm just wondering, what might be your top concerns regarding tipping points in these models, where we have sort of points of no return, and one of them